Okay, this lecture is specific on writing memos. And so your assignment that goes along with your accuracy and precision experiment will be to write a memo. And the target of the memo will be to indicate to a company how your metrics compare to your competitors. So here's the scenario. A lot of businesses do opposition research, not just for marketing and for trying to get an edge on the market share, but also for performance metrics. And so if you are in pharmaceutical manufacturing, you generally know how much it costs other manufacturers to do the same process you do. If you're an auto manufacturer, you know what your labor costs should be, and you know how much scrap you should generate compared to industry average. Leaders of industry actually get together and talk about these things because they need to all stay roughly within a percentage of one another, just to make sure that no one exceeds or is way below market standards, and then their own individual profits come from optimizing their process. So as engineers, optimizing your process isn't just about optimizing your process within your building, but also knowing how you compare to those who would be considered competitives of whatever industry you're a part of. So if you're a civil engineer working in an architecture firm and you're pitching proposals for capital build projects, you want to know what your competition is going to come in as a general price point so that you can make sure that you're also within that same general price point and you don't lose that competitive advantage. So regardless of what industry you're a part of, understanding how you compare to your competitors is important. And so the data that was your class data is going to serve as your competitor market knowledge. So the class data is your industry in general, how are they doing? Then your specific data is your company, how are they performing? And so instead of what you actually did, which was you as an individual did the experiment and you are comparing it to a class, you're going to imagine, role play, in this scenario that you are representing a company and that the class-wide data is the industry standard. And so your memo is to the group of engineers, to the production facility, however you want to describe it, but you're going to compare your performance metrics to industry standards and say whether or not you guys are doing okay. So from an accuracy perspective, your measurements, how well did you do compared to industry? Your precision levels, how well did you do compared to industry? If you are above, what does that mean for opportunity? If you're below, what does that mean needs to be adjusted? So ignore the process itself. Obviously, there's no industry that exists that's throwing cards into a bucket or a pan or a bowl or a hat. What you are focused on is making a comparison between one set of data and another and communicating that in a way that is for a 1K that might come out via memo. It provides brief, specific actions, recommendations, observations, or changes within an organization. That's what we're doing. We're going to provide observations from data we've gathered and recommendations associated with that data. And so an engineering memo will have a header, and you'll see an example of this in a second, who the memo is to, who the memo is from, that would be yourself, the date and the subject. The who the memo is to, you may use some creativity. Again, a common group would be to executive level, like the CIO, CFO, CEOs. It could be to the overall engineering team. It could be to the management team. It could be to marketing or promotion if you're talking about how you want to provide this information and talk up the company based on the data that you've gotten. You can choose who that is. The purpose paragraph will go over the topic of the memo and the overview of the contents. It's the introduction. The discussion paragraph is the meat of the content. It's what you're really wanting to focus on, and you're presenting that in a logical order of what information you have. And then the closing talks about further actions or recommendations. So this is an example of the header, and this is just cut and paste from the memo template or memo example I provided. So ignore the word header, but starting with either memo or memorandum, either one is acceptable. To, from, date, subject, and then a salutation. The salutation should align with what you say to. So in this case, it says all staff, and the salutation is coworkers, and it comes from the production manager. You could say that I'm John Smith, I'm a senior project engineer, and the memo is going out to all engineers, and my salutation would be fellow engineers, comma. The purpose paragraph that is given in the sample just talks about that certain timings are not being followed and it affects productivity. So in this case, you're going to say that an experiment was done to measure accuracy and precision within our operations, something to that effect. The discussion, they go into the actual data, and here the data is presented. So you need to decide in your discussion paragraph what data is being presented and how you're going to present it. And then finally, their actions and recommendations paragraph, in this case, is actually not a paragraph, it's actually a series of policies. Your recommendations could also be notes on how much of an increase or decrease in precision and accuracy you noticed, and what might be the potential concern or benefit from having a better accuracy or a better precision. They give a closing paragraph that's kind of in words talking about the same recommendations they did in bullet point. Also helpful to give some narration to help ensure that the reader understands what's being discussed. And then there's a closing paragraph and a thank you, which is a polite way to end the memo. So as you notice, the contents somewhat resemble a letter. We'll be doing a formal proposal, and you'll see that it's a very similar template, much wider audience, generally speaking, much wider audience. You rarely send a memo to one person. It's usually for broad audiences, and so it's worded in a way that's not overly specific because it's to a larger group than an individual person, and yet it also is very informative. So that's the point and purpose of the memo. So your assignment, that introduction, should include the experiment setup and execution. So you performed a sample 52 iterations. You don't necessarily need to describe the playing cards, and because that's not relevant in this case. If you were writing a memo about a serious experiment that had been performed, you would want to include the setup and execution. But in this case, you would just say that the operation was monitored with 52 iterations to create our data pool. That would be appropriate in this case. And then your measures of accuracy and precision. How do you know if it's accurate? How do you know if it's precise? So the accuracy, we said, were successes and failures. Precision, we said, was within that first 12 inches. So you've got a couple different things to compare. And then the group results, again, are competitors. It's the industry standard. Are yours better, worse, similar? And what should you do about it? Now, obviously, again, we're not talking about a specific technique on throwing cards. What you're going to say is, you know, our results were found to have less successes than the industry standard, which means that we need to improve this performance or we will find ourselves being cut out of the market edge, something similar to that. So it's going to be written a little bit of a creative writing assignment because you're taking on a role, you're talking about this situation and presenting it to an audience, but it still should be able to communicate that an experiment was conducted, your research showed certain measurements, those measurements are being compared to another set of measurements, and what's the implication of that. So that all is for the memo assignment. Now, really quickly, I'm going to switch screens, and this PDF file shows the exact same thing that I just went through on the PowerPoint, but that way you have the format. You can see everything is left justified. It's not centered. The only bold are for the headings. You can see that paragraphs are used, a space between each paragraph, very readable, one sheet of paper. You could do a memo that's 2 sheets of paper, but you really want to get, or 2 sides of a single sheet of paper. So if your memo spills onto 2 pages, that's okay. And next week, we will talk a little bit about data presentation, some graphs or charts or images that you might want to include on your memo. That may cause it to spill onto the back side, but for a memo, you're looking at a short document, a 1-page document. So front and back would be the most that you would ever see in a memo. And then finally, the rubric that you want to make sure that you're comparing yourself to, similar rubric to what we saw. This isn't due until the 17th. And you'll see that we still have the original categories of addressing the main goal, the organization of thought, complexity, command of the English language, and the format, or I guess format's new. So organization, complexity, command of English, those will always be there, as well as main goal. What's been added for this writing assignment? Presentation of the data, engaging and clear within the narrative of the work. Discussion of the result, compares and contrasts your individual results to the larger group, and talks about these concepts in thought-provoking ways, ways that inspire the individuals reading the memo to want to be a part of the change for the betterment and improvement. And then finally, make sure that all of your formatting elements are present, that you follow the format given to you in the sample. So we will have time to talk about this rubric face-to-face next week, as well as talking a little bit more about that presentation of the data section to see if a graphical presentation might be warranted in this situation. But in the meantime, you can get started on writing the content and doing those comparisons between your data and the larger group data, developing that format that you need in Word, start working with the language, and all of that is going to count as the work that you would do in class on Thursday. It's counted as a writing day. So to get that draft going so that when we come back to class, we will be moving on to the next experiment, but we can also talk some about visual depictions of data and see if that's appropriate for your memo. All right, as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via email. Have a great day.